If you were to ask me what is the best new thing introduced in Pokémon Sun and Moon, it would be a tough call between Ride Pokémon and Alolan forms. Now, neither of those is perfect, but the principle behind both of them is fantastic. I've talked before about my ideas for Ride Pokémon in my video on an open world Pokémon game, and also in my review of Let's Go, so today, let's discuss the best and worst of Alolan forms. The reason I think the idea of regional variants in general is so fantastic is that there's a lot of real-world parallels. Most living things are different depending on where they're from. Look at Indian and African elephants, for example. They're essentially the same creature, but they've actually diverged enough that they're two different species. There's also multiple species of giraffe with different coat patterns in different parts of Africa. But even more closely related creatures still have variants too. Look at all the different kinds of caribou and reindeer and how different their sizes and antler shapes can be, even though they're all the same species, Rangifer tarandus. Or the most obvious example, dogs and wolves all being Canis lupus. You don't even have to look at the man-made dog breeds for variety. Wild wolves come in a bunch of different sizes and coat colors too, adapting to their environments. I've discussed before how Pokemon are incredibly adaptable, so it's actually kind of surprising that the Wurmple, for example, that you find in Hoenn looks exactly the same as the one you find in Sinnoh, where the climate is much colder. Or that Vullaby look the same whether they're from the hyper-urban environments of Unova or the wilder habitats of Alola. And we've actually seen a number of different regional variants in the anime. In the Orange Islands, there were the Pokemon from Pinken Island, which were, predictably, pink, and also the ones from Valencia Islands that had different colors and patterns. But in the main series games, regional variants had a very minimal presence before Generation 7. Arbok had a couple of different patterns, and the Pokédex says there could be as many as 20, but we've only seen 3 in the main games, and there hasn't been a new one since Generation 3. And Arbok just had different sprites in each game. Those patterns didn't carry through if you traded them, for example. There are 20 different Vivillon, which vary depending on where in the real world they were caught, but I think that's it. And all of these variations are purely cosmetic, meaning the Pokemon looks different, but it's not deeper than that. Their types, abilities, moves, those are all the same. So the introduction of Alolan forms fixed all of that. Now we finally have Pokemon that not only look different, but behave differently, have different types and all that, but are still close enough to be considered the same Pokemon. The Red Fox Vulpix and the Arctic Fox Vulpix are very different, but they can still both be Vulpix. Now that doesn't mean that I think every Alolan form is great. There were definitely missteps. For example, I'm not a fan of the direction that they went in with Sandshrew and Sandslash. I love Sandshrew's igloo design and Sandslash's claws that are reminiscent of ice axes, but to me, Sandshrew is a Pokemon with such a strong desert connection that making one that lives on an icy mountain, which is kind of like the opposite of a desert, it feels wrong to me. Like at one point it stops being a Sandshrew and starts being something else. As far as the designs though, they're fine. My design critiques for the Alolan forms are actually fairly minimal, like how Raichu's legs just look like blobs and don't seem to have skeletons in them, or Persian's head being way too big and round. I've always felt that Cantonian Persian's head is too small though, so I guess they just overcorrected. And the roundness of the head, I get that that was a groomed trait, so I don't like it, but I'll accept it. I really like Alolan Geodude and Graveler, although I don't think that they really communicate to the electric type. Maybe steel type would have been more fitting for these designs. But I really don't like Alolan Golem's design much, and I actually used one in my team in Let's Go. I like the railgun design, but the tiny arms and the thick legs don't do it for me, and I wish they hadn't given it such prominent facial hair. I get and like the idea of iron shavings being the hair, but with such a prominent mustache and beard, Golem becomes a very gendered, masculine design. It plays on our gender stereotypes, and I just don't think that was necessary. They could have done the iron hair in other ways. Speaking of hair, you already know where this is going. Alolan Dugtrio is probably the only Alolan design that I think is poorly done all around. The problem begins with the fact that we're starting with the most basic, under-designed Pokemon of Generation 1. I think there are plenty of ways they could have made Dugtrio more interesting. With some of the other Alolan forms, they changed designs pretty significantly. But with Dugtrio, it basically just looks like Cantonian Dugtrio wearing wigs. They changed one element, and they didn't really integrate it into the design. I like the reference to Pele's hair, which is a form of lava that looks like fur, but those very humanoid haircuts don't make anyone think of Pele's hair. It just looks like wigs. In that regard, even Diglett is better, because even though it looks almost the same as the Kanto version, at least those three little hairs look like they belong. But overall, I think the designs are really good. Even Raticate, which a lot of people criticize for being too fat, actually looks more natural to me. It's fat because it's a glutton, so that works. But most importantly, it actually keeps its mouth shut. Cantonian Raticate looks very uncomfortable, but Alolan Raticate just has its mouth full. I love the flowy, misty look of Alolan Vulpix and Ninetales. The oily colors of Grimer and Muck are great, and how they use solid debris as teeth and claws is really clever. And of course, Alolan Executor is basically what Executor should have looked like from the beginning. The tail is awesome. It references how some coconut trees have a sort of offshoot trunk or just another tree that grows right next to it, and how they sometimes grow almost horizontally to escape the shade of the bigger tree. I like Alolan forms so much that I worry that they're not going to make new regional Pokemon in future generations. I don't want regional Pokemon to be like Mega Evolution, a mechanic that was introduced very prominently in one generation and then almost completely ignored in the next one. This is such a good idea. I will be terribly disappointed if they don't keep it up. And they should make regional variants of Pokemon from regions other than Kanto too. I get that they're focusing on redesigning older Pokemon, but I hope that there's a good range of generations in the next batch of regionals. How do you feel about Alolan forms or the concept of regional variants in general? Is there anything that you think could have been done better? I'd love to chat about it in the comments. And please don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, subscribe if you're new, and share this video with your friends. I'm Umbreon Libris, and I'll see you in the next chapter.